You are listening to the Knightline Sports Network, brought to you by Travis Dever and the Dever team, 386-690-1636.
Welcome to episode 1 of the American Formula One Driver Podcast with me, your host, Sam Albuquerque. This podcast series is about one thing: examining and analyzing the concept and impact of an American Formula One driver. We plan on doing that by going through the process of trying to find out who that driver could be. In episode 1, we'll start that process by taking a look back at the history of Formula One and its relationship with the United States. We'll also bring you up to date by analyzing Formula One's current state in America and examining the country's biggest tie to F1, its American ownership group, Liberty Media. To wrap up episode 1, we'll talk about fans and how an American Formula One driver can help make some. This is episode 1 of the American Formula One Driver Podcast.
And Prost is stopping, and Senna crosses the line before he gets there.
Lewis Hamilton wins the British Grand Prix. A fantastic performance.
Into the first turn we go. Is this the lead now for Rosberg? Hamilton.
Grid is clear. The lights go. And Senna sprints away.
Going fast and competing at the highest levels are two of the most American things I can think of. And yet Formula One, the fastest and highest level of motorsports competition, isn't a mainstay in American sports culture. Now, why is that? Do Americans not like motorsports? Historically speaking, that can't be it. Just take a quick look at the significance and overall fanfare around races like the Daytona 500 or the Indianapolis 500. Sure, those races and the series they're a part of don't hold the same level of interest as the NFL or the NBA within American sports culture, but they still manage to garner the attention of millions of eyeballs each year. So no, I don't think Americans simply don't like racing. Is it that they just don't like Formula One? Well, that's where it starts to get tricky, and why we have to take a look back at the history of Formula One to understand its relationship with America. Since the first Formula One season in 1950, the United States, in one form or another, has been a part of the Formula One calendar. Originally, the famous Indianapolis 500 was the first race to be held in America, and for a decade, it was part of the F1 calendar. In 1958, the United States Grand Prix joined the Indy 500 as a second race on the F1 calendar, and after bouncing around for a couple years, the United States Grand Prix settled in to its new home at Watkins Glen in upstate New York for the next couple of decades, as the Indy 500 fell off F1's calendar in 1961. From Formula One's inception in 1950 to 1991, there was at least one race held in the US, and at times through the late 50s, the late 70s, and the early 80s, 2 Grand Prix were actually held in the US per season in places like Long Beach, California, Detroit, Las Vegas, Phoenix, among a few others. Not only did this 40-year period seem to be the golden age of Grand Prix in the US, but it also felt like the golden age of Formula One drivers. America's only driver champions of Formula One were Phil Hill in 1961 and one of the most famous names in American racing, Mario Andretti, who won in 1978. Other than Hill and Andretti, drivers like Dan Gurney also had success in Formula One in the 60s, winning 4 races throughout his 10-year career and finishing as high as 4th in the Drivers' Championship. Fellow 60s F1 driver Richie Ginther was also a race winner. His only victory came in the 1965 Mexican Grand Prix. But Ginther did manage to finish 3rd in the 1963 Drivers' Championship, higher than Dan Gurney ever finished, despite his 3 less wins. In the early 70s, minus the one-off season in 1964, Peter Revson was the American driver of note in F1. In really only 2 full seasons in the series, Revson earned 8 podiums, 2 race wins, and finished 5th in the Drivers' Championship. Unfortunately, Revson died in the 1974 season during a test lap at the South African Grand Prix, where he actually finished 2nd the year before. Eddie Cheever was another notable American Formula One driver in the 80s, who earned 9 total podiums in his 132 Formula One starts, but never winning a race. After Cheever, that was sort of it for American drivers in Formula One. The golden era of Formula One racing in America, those 40 years when an American driver was usually competitive in the Drivers' Championship, and there was at least one race here at home, began to take a turn in the early 90s. From 92 to 99, not only were there no Grand Prix in the US, but Michael Andretti's lone season in 1993 was the last time an American was on the grid for the rest of the decade. Andretti's one podium and 7 total points also just so happened to be the last time an American driver earned even a single point in a Formula One race. Though most of the 90s were a bit of a down moment for F1 in America, a bit of hope crept back in at the start of the new millennium. Formula One was on its way back to America, and it was looking to make some noise in its return. So Formula One went back to where it all started here in the States, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway at the Brickyard. And well, not only did they make some noise, they broke some records.
USA for the first time in 9 years for round 15 of the Formula One World Championship, and they return to the very heart of American motorsport, Indianapolis. The old Brickyard, built back in 1909, and a huge crowd of 250,000.
The 2000 United States Grand Prix at Indianapolis was the highest ever attended race in Formula One history, with over 250,000 people in attendance. Not only did Formula One's return to the US break records, but it also got rave reviews from 7-time Formula One champion Michael Schumacher, who happened to win the 2000 United States Grand Prix.
We've been here, and I guess nobody of us expected to have such a great welcome from the American fans, although it's probably not only American because they came here from all over the world. But seeing so many people here celebrating with us this victory, 1-2 for Ferrari, it's, the best.
Though they reached new heights during this race, it was short-lived. The 2000s never matched the golden era of Formula One in America. And one of the biggest reasons why was the 2005 United States Grand Prix.
I can tell you, you've been watching this program for an hour, and you know far more about the situation here than the poor old 120,000 people sitting in the grandstands here at Indianapolis on my way.
Due to a tire issue by its supplier Michelin, only 6 cars ended up racing in the 2005 United States Grand Prix, leaving fans, teams, and sponsors completely in shock for what turned out to be one of the strangest races in Formula One history, and became a dark cloud over the series' popularity here in America. After the formation lap before the race officially began, 14 of the 20 cars on the grid went to the pits and didn't start the race.
So, World Championship leader.
You know our plan is for the start. Straight in the pits, please, mate.
Yeah, well, he knows that because he's on his way in already. Looks like teammate Fisichella just in front of him, and I think that McLaren Toyota, there's the pole sitter Jarno Trulli pouring into the pits, and just listen to the crowd.
And after an hour and a half of only 6 cars racing, Michael Schumacher of Ferrari crossed the finish line first, winning his 4th United States Grand Prix in his last 6 tries.
Across the line goes Michael Schumacher to win the 6th and possibly last Grand Prix here at Indianapolis.
But I bet if you asked the American fans at that race, they'd say it felt like nobody won. And even though I wouldn't say Schumacher agrees with that, he definitely had some trepidation in celebrating this victory.
The two of us we had going. There was only the two of us, and the team said, let's go and have fun. And that's what we had amongst us. Obviously, a bit of a strange Grand Prix. Not the right way to win my first one this year.
And though the 2005 United States Grand Prix wasn't the official end of Formula One's stint in Indianapolis, it did feel like the end. And following the 2007 United States Grand Prix at Indianapolis, America once again fell off the Formula One calendar. As for drivers, well, it's been an even poorer run of form. Scott Speed in 2006 was the first American driver since Michael Andretti in 1993 to drive a full season in F1. But Speed failed to register even a single point in his 1.5 seasons in Formula One. The only other driver to even get behind the wheel of an F1 car since Speed is Alexander Rossi, who managed to race 5 times in 2015, but also failed to score a single point. In 2017, a major shift occurred in Formula One's relationship with America. Liberty Media, a publicly traded American mass communications company that's based in Colorado and was founded by American billionaire John C. Malone, completed its acquisition of Formula One. This purchase signaled new life for the sport in the U.S. Not only did it mean the series is now operated by an American corporation, it was operated by a corporation that understood American sports culture through their ownership of the Atlanta Braves, and also a corporation that understood the American media through its stakes in companies like SiriusXM, iHeartMedia, Warner Media, and Live Nation Entertainment. With Liberty Media now calling the shots in Formula One, not only did they understand the American sports market and the American media, they also were acutely aware of how much money was being left on the bone for the series without the attention of the American sports market. This, more than anything else, is enough of a reason to make growth in the US a priority for Formula One. And oh boy, it sure feels like they have made America a priority. Efforts like a widely popular Netflix series, to extending its broadcast deal with ESPN, to sponsorship deals with companies with huge footprints in America, to adding a second American-based Grand Prix to its calendar starting in 2022, Formula One under Liberty Media has put together an approach that seems to be working here in the States. And the first and most basic way to prove that and gauge a sport's popularity is simply by looking at their television ratings. As of early August 2021, ESPN's broadcast of Formula One has an average of 946,000 viewers per race over its first 11 Grand Prix, which, yes, compares poorly to sports like the NBA or the NFL in America, but compared to itself since its broadcast deal with ESPN began in 2018, the number of average viewers per race has increased by nearly 60%, going from 554,000 to 946,000 average viewers per race. That seems to indicate that their plan is working. Another metric to look at is social media. And though it's difficult to track exactly how many F1 social media followers are in America, we can look at its recent overall growth to get a better understanding of its popularity. Following the 2020 pandemic-shortened season, Formula One recorded a 99% increase in their social engagement numbers from the prior year and a 35% increase in their total follower count across major platforms like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and others. The series says it's the fastest growing major sport on these platforms. Other projects, specifically the Netflix documentary series called F1 Drive to Survive, is also hard to quantify, especially given Netflix's protection over its viewer numbers. But anecdotally speaking, it's also been a huge factor in the recent growth of the sport here in America. To dig a little deeper on America's current and past relationship with Formula One, we enlisted the help of an expert.
Hi, my name is Peter Habeck, and I have been working in Formula One for the past 15 years or so, from a grassroots level to working with the Mercedes AMG F1 team most recently, demonstrating Lewis Hamilton's W07 at the 2019 Sonoma Speed Festival. I tweet out quite a bit about Formula One in America, write about it, and consult and advise brands, companies, and F1 teams on the American public and Formula One in general as it relates to growing the audience in America and how brands can use Formula One as a platform.
Our conversation with Peter about his unique perspective and experience of working with Formula One, its teams, and fans, along with his personal experience of being a Formula One fan here in the US, provides us with a huge amount of insight on the sport's relationship with this country. So let's not waste any time and get right to Peter. Peter, I want to start off with you. So let's take it all the way back to the inception. How did you become a Formula One fan here in America?
I started off as a fan of just sports in general, mainly stick and ball, growing up in high school. It wasn't until after college, my mom, of all people, got very interested in club racing on Long Island. She was very active with her car club and car community, invited me to join them for a track day. And I really enjoyed the experience, the real world application of hands-on work on a car, the engineering, the principles and the athleticism and I would say, all aspects of driving at speed on track. And it took me a little while to kind of figure out how to incorporate that interest with engineering. But after looking at what was available at the time, Formula One spoke to me as one of the most engineering intensive and development intensive areas of motorsport. And that, to me, spoke the loudest.
So walk me through how you went from being a Formula One fan and a race fan in general to working with Formula One, to covering Formula One. Take me through that process, and also tell me a little bit about the projects you've worked on.
Not having really any real connection to professional racing or at racing at any kind of serious level, it was up to myself to figure out how to create the opportunities and to get the understanding that would kind of later form the basis for what I do now in Formula One. That was a very grassroots approach, organizing watch parties in San Francisco starting in 2005, from 10 people sitting around a table in a bar to, hundreds of people coming out for live watch parties in bars in San Francisco. It really kind of grew from there. I started writing about the sport and was later credited as a journalist to cover several races. I've done over 20, I think, now. And then working on special projects with things like the Senna movie. The distribution of that film in the United States was a sort of strategic opportunity to help the distribution company understand where to screen the movie. From there, I was later involved with the running of Lewis Hamilton's W07 at the Sonoma Speed Festival. That was the first ever demonstration in front of an American public of a modern era turbo hybrid car. So it was a very, very involved and a rather elaborate undertaking, but very, very rewarding for both the team and American fans. So I kind of see myself now as sort of that piece between an event, the sport, the team, and the fan, and really managing those needs and relationships to the benefit of all, and certainly representing the American fans' interest in Formula One.
Peter, speaking of American fans, and obviously given your expertise on American fans and experience with them, where do you think we are in Formula One's popularity with American fans and in America in general? Would you say that this is the most popular Formula One has ever been in America?
It's on its way. I would say, certainly the days of, Mario Andretti's championship, there was a huge interest. Nigel Mansell's coming over to IndyCar also carried with it an interest in what he had done in Formula One. So I think as a percentage of overall viewership, I don't have those numbers, but I would say certainly as a percentage of engaged viewers, it's higher today. Folks who are taking in an event and then sharing with their friends. I think we're seeing a huge, uptick in all sports. But yeah, I would say we're well on our way. I mean, there's some big players in the sports and entertainment space. I'm not sure Formula One is going to, knock the NFL off the top spot anytime soon. But there are really great signs of some cross-pollination happening between, the big four and stars from the big four, even talking about Formula One. J.J. Watt talking about Formula One in a recent tweet, and it highlighted the relevance of a professional athlete in another sport to Formula One, which really, 10 years ago would have been a pretty rare thing. So I think thinking about Drive to Survive, I mean, the impact and the platform on which people can kind of go, okay, I think I understand what's going on here in the sport, or at least I have some experience of what to compare something that I see in the future to, so I can follow this storyline for more than a single race. I can actually compare it to a previous season. That's huge. And the ability to be able to do that and bring in high-profile fans is huge.
What are some of the things that you think Formula One need to do to get to a point where you can eventually say they are unequivocally the most popular they've ever been here in America?
Well, I think that Formula One is on the right path, and it's certainly doing what it needs to set up, I think, for fans in America to understand the sport, and now it needs to actually create access to the sport. And access means it needs to host more races in America, which in 2022, we'll see the addition of a race in Florida and Miami. So that's all positive there. A third race would be great as well, in addition to Austin. The sport of Formula One is one thing on a television sports broadcast. I think it's an entirely other thing in person. That's the real experience that folks who are watching Drive to Survive, they really have that to look forward to. If they haven't already, they're really in for a treat to see these cars move on track in person. It's a whole different thing to see a car corner at speed or change direction at speed when you're standing on the corner and seeing it. It's violent. It's a very visceral experience, I think, as a fan, and it certainly is as a driver. And bringing that experience to more fans to be able to see in person is, I think, a big next step. And Formula One's already on the way.
Let's talk a little bit more about the idea of an American Formula One driver. So the first question I want to start off with specifically about that is, do you think we'll see an American driver on the F1 grid in the next 5 years?
Yes, I think we'll see another American driver in the next 5 years. I'm hopeful that they can be in a situation where they have a stable and competitive team around them. I think that's a key part of the success of not only that particular driver, but I think the sport in America does need to see an American driver in order to onboard more American-based and American fans of Formula One. So I think the rule of thumb, varies depending on who you ask, but the winningness of the package, which is the car plus the driver, generally tends to be in favor of about 80% of the car's ability to perform, and then about 20% of the driver. You can have a world championship driver in a very back of the grid car and really have a no win, no hope season. And that I don't think that would serve the ultimate talents of that driver very well. But you'd want an American, I think, in a competitive car. And going to Zach Brown, I mean, he's got an option to bring on a U.S.-born driver named Yugo Chukwu. He is a karting star and a McLaren prospect, let's say. Zach Brown has an option to use Yugo's services with the team going forward. So that's certainly a great line going forward. But Yugo's, I think, 13, so he's got a little ways to go, in the progression of his career. But we're seeing American flashes of brilliance that are deserving of the attention of Formula One teams getting recognized. So that's a huge watch this space kind of moment. But yeah, it is possible for Americans to get from here to there. And I kind of liken it a little bit like a sort of a threading of a needle. We've seen sort of the technique you've probably seen where someone holds a needle with one hand and then lines up the thread with the other hand and then tries to put it through the needle. We've seen that succeed a few times. We've seen Alex Rossi, we've seen Scott Speed. It can happen. That isn't a very stable platform, I think, to get a stream of drivers through. And I kind of liken the other way of, threading a needle is you've probably seen the YouTube video where you lay out the palm of your hand and then you lay the thread down and then you take the needle eye and move it over the palm of your hand, pressing into the thread, and that will also thread the needle. And I think we're kind of more at that phase now, if you like, where we have a more stable platform with the sports interest in America, with, I think, a feeder series that's recognized by Formula One and multiple series recognized by Formula One as part of the show bill now that hosts a Grand Prix weekend. We see an F3, an F2, an F1 race. So there's clear lines that are kind of being drawn into how these different opportunities can come about. And I think the challenge for Americans is, it's a big step to commit to an international racing career as opposed to a racing career in the United States. I think the hope is as we move forward, we will see folks like Yugo really show that it can be done in the current era and show that they can land in a good team, which McLaren is certainly one of them. And provide that example for others to follow.
Peter, let's wrap it up on this question here. Looking at the current crop of American drivers, obviously you mentioned Hugo here, whose affiliation with McLaren makes him a very easy choice in this conversation. But even other drivers like Logan Sargent, who had a really great run in F3 with Prema a couple years back, where he essentially almost won the F3 championship. I think he lost by 2 points because he was driven off the track in that last race. Or a guy like Jack Crawford, who has an affiliation with Red Bull Racing and is in F3 right now, or Juan Manuel Carrera, who got all the way up to Formula 2 before he had that terrible accident, but is in F3 now. Or even a Hunter Yeany, who's in British Formula 3 right now, racing in that competition this season. When you look at this current crop, some of the drivers I mentioned, maybe some that I didn't mention, who do you think could be that driver to break through in Formula One in, say, the next 5 years?
Juan Manuel Correa, sustained a huge injury, about two years ago. So, just seeing him race again was awesome. I'm really grateful that he's back in the track. But it highlights that things can change for these drivers. Not only are some of these guys maybe running on fumes financially, just the whole inside baseball take on how these guys are actually holding up in their current sort of rally to garner opportunity going forward is tough. I mean, if you look at Formula One, not a lot of seats open up. And unless you've got, the kind of backing like Lance Stroll or Nicholas Latifi, I mean, those guys are real rare. It's a very tough game to predict. I generally tend to focus on what the sport is doing on track and over air and in person. But speaking to a colleague at the FIA, I learned some great insights from who they see as coming up from the American side, karting talent wise. Kai Sorensen was another name out of North Carolina to keep an eye on. So looking at these guys almost a generation before the crop that you mentioned is where I would tend to kind of focus a lot of my sort of aspirations. It's hard to get hitched up to these guys in a hopes and dreams phase of their career and see them go so far and then just wait for an opportunity. It's very, very difficult. One thing I would like to see is an 11th or even a 12th team join the grid, ideally another one with U.S. backing or a U.S.-based F1 team, and really focus on that and make that a priority for them as a team and as a brand. Not that Haas can't flip the switch and start doing that next season either. But that needs to change, I think, along with the playing field that we have in Formula One. I think we need to see in 2022 the new regulations, which include cost cap spending rules, really create a level playing field. And I think we'll see that create, I think, a more attractive proposition to American talent to focus on and eventually gain a seat. There's too much talent worldwide chasing a seat right now in Formula One. I mean, hundreds of people for every one seat that becomes open. So it's very, very tricky, I think, to predict exactly where these guys are. And I would love to see more deals like Hugo's come about, where a current Formula One team takes an interest in their career, similar to what happened to Lewis Hamilton early on in his career. Similar age, Ron Dennis signed Lewis, and we see Hugo with the same team with McLaren. So commitment from both sides early on, I think, is what's going to be key to see these guys take a seat in Formula One.
Big thanks to Peter for speaking about his experience and giving us some great insight about Formula One here in the U.S. You'll hear from him again later throughout the podcast.
Hey, this is Travis Dever, Kai's Real Estate, the Dever team, New Smyrna Beach. Your source for real estate and everything else, New Smyrna Beach. Proud sponsor of Knightline. Call me anytime at 386-690-1636. That's 386-690-1636. Let me show you my hometown, New Smyrna Beach, UCF's favorite beach. Go Knights and charge on.
An auto accident can change your life forever. At Chad Barr Law, we are raising the bar on what to expect from your personal injury attorney. Hi, I'm Chad Barr, and I want you to know that our entire team is dedicated to providing you with the representation you deserve in your greatest time of need. If you or a loved one have been injured in an auto accident, call 407-599-9036 for a free consultation or visit chadbarlaw.com. At Chad Barr Law, our clients come to us in need and leave as family. Offices, Altamont Springs.
Looking for more out of your Porsche? Look no further than Flat6Motorsports.com. They have the widest selection of aftermarket Porsche parts anywhere in the world. With over 85 product lines and in-depth expertise, Flat6Motorsports.com is your one-stop shop for any Porsche performance needs. Whether you're shopping for intakes, exhausts, suspension, or tuning, they have you covered. Flat6Motorsports.com is the premier Porsche aftermarket specialist. Check them out at Flat6Motorsports.com.
In this episode, we've touched on a variety of subjects, but the one we're going to close this episode with is probably the most important. We're going to examine the role a driver plays in developing Formula One fans. Like most individualistic type sports like golf or tennis, the individual at center stage is the one that gets the attention from the fans. Though Formula One is a team sport, there's only one person driving the car. And unlike most American team sports, F1 teams don't represent much. They don't represent a city like the Philadelphia Eagles or the Los Angeles Lakers. And really, other than Ferrari, most teams aren't something that fans identify with. For the most part, the teams are companies using Formula One as a billboard to grab the fans' attention and sell them something, which, is neither here nor there. But it makes it less likely for a fan to attach themselves to a team. So they attach themselves to drivers. And when you have a driver with personality who is competitive and chooses to represent their country proudly, that country usually embraces the driver and in a few cases inspires more high-level drivers. The example that pops up in my head is Brazil. It has produced 3 different Formula One driver champions and a steady stream of relevant and competitive drivers going back to Emerson Fittipaldi in the 70s, Nelson Piquet in the 80s, Ayrton Senna in the late 80s and early 90s, Rubens Barrichello in the 90s and 2000s, and Felipe Massa from the early 2000s all the way to 2017. Brazil is crazy for Formula One, and a lot of its fans can be traced to one of these drivers, especially Ayrton Senna. And to understand how a driver who represents their country can make Formula One fans and how specifically an American driver can help make fans here in the US, I decided to speak to fans from Brazil to understand how these drivers captured their imagination and how they fell in love with the sport through the success of their fellow countrymen. And for me, there was no better place to start than speaking with the biggest Ayrton Senna fan that I know, my father.
Hi, my name is Walter Nunes. I'm 58 years old and a Formula One fan from João Pessoa, Brazil. My favorite driver of all time is Ayrton Senna.
Now, before we speak with my old man, I want to share with you the story of how this project came about. See, I was born in Brazil, but I moved to Florida as a kid and spent the better part of 2 decades here. Though I am an enormous sports fan, I always hated racing. My dad, on the other hand, loved it. And like any good son, I made fun of the sport he loved. It wasn't until last year that a combination of the COVID-19 pandemic and my older brother nagging me about it that I finally watched the Netflix series Formula One Drive to Survive. And like many other stories you'll hear about this show, I was hooked. And the more I developed a love for the sport, the more my dad and I talked about it. And I learned about the likes of Emerson Fittipaldi and Nelson Piquet, Felipe Massa, Rubens Barrichello, and yes, Ayrton Senna. It was through those conversations with my old man in the early parts of this project that the concept came out. Yes, drivers make fans, but Brazilian drivers make more Brazilian fans. British drivers make more British fans. And even Finnish drivers make more Finnish fans. So to make American fans, there probably needs to be American drivers. So to get to know more about how drivers like Piquet, Barrichello, and Senna captured the imaginations of Brazilian fans, let's talk to some, starting with my pops. Dad, how did you become a Formula One fan?
I don't remember exactly the year, but I was very young when I saw for the first time Formula One with Emerson Fittipaldi. Then I'm continue following Emerson Fittipaldi, Nelson Piquet, José Carlos Paty, and Ayrton Senna. That's for me was the best one, Ayrton Senna.
Did your dad and my grandpa bring you into Formula One, or how did you start watching it in the first place?
Well, we don't have a lot of access on my father's time on Formula One. When I started to see Formula One, I was about like 24 years old, and my dad never saw Formula One. He's not a real fan on that.
So there was no real way to watch races when you were a kid?
No, really.
And it wasn't until you got to 24 years old where you first started watching races?
Correct. When Globo started broadcasting Formula One Brazil, we have more access to Formula One, to the race. Then we start to have a lot of fans in Formula One. Until that, nobody knows about Formula One.
When was that? Do you remember around the time when you were 24? So what is that, 58, like 1980s?
Yeah, it's around 1983, 84. I don't remember exactly the year. I started following the Formula One, but it's around that in the 80s.
And when you start watching in the 80s, that's when Nelson Piquet and Ayrton Senna started. What was that experience like for you? What was the driver that you liked the most right at the beginning?
Piquet started before Ayrton Senna, and he had a lot of a good race. When Ayrton Senna started, he looks like better than Nelson Piquet, and most the people in Brazil decide for Senna. Senna was the best in that time. He was superior than Nelson Piquet, Alain Prost, everybody. He was something phenomenal.
So when Globo starts to broadcast Formula One races, and for those of you who don't know, Globo is a Brazilian broadcast channel, sort of like CBS, ABC, NBC, but it's really the only one in Brazil. So it's combine all of those into one. That's Globo. At least it was in this time. There were obviously other channels, but Globo was the mainstay in Brazilian broadcasting. But when Globo starts to broadcast a Formula One race, what was it like to watch a race? What was it like on a Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon when a Senna race was about to take place?
By this time, everybody was looking for Formula One. Every Sunday, we was in the front of TV to see the race. But when Senna's coming, nobody wants to go anywhere before see the race. A lot of times at home, my wife says, we need to go to the church, or we need to go to the beach, or anything like that. No, I just want to go after I see the race, because it was very, very, very excited to see Senna drive, because it doesn't matter if you start in the first place or the last place. On the end of the race, we see Senna in the first place. Doesn't matter if it's a sunny day or if it's rain. Doesn't matter if the race is in Brazil or out of Brazil. Senna is doing very, very emotions for everybody.
Why was Senna your favorite driver?
Well, because he was very good guy, very popular. He drive like everybody expected. Everybody expected a winner, and Senna win most race he drive.
You mentioned that he was a good guy, and it's sort of one of the biggest parts of the Senna story is his impact on Brazil as a country. Obviously, Brazil has always had issues, political, economic. It's, you obviously lived there a lot longer than I did. But what did having a champion like that, a guy who lived up to the expectation, like you said, that you expected him to win, he goes out there and wins every time. What does that mean for Brazil as a country, for its people?
Well, when Senna came to talk on the TV, give some interviews, he don't talk by him, but he talking by like the whole country. He represents everybody when he was driving. When he start to give interview for everybody, you can see the love he has for the Formula One and the love he has for the country. It's a combination everybody wants. Like we expect Senna win the race, take the Brazilian flag, and with him come all the country, come all the Brazilians.
Do you think you, or maybe Brazil in general, would have loved Formula One as much as everyone did in Brazil if Senna wasn't around, if he didn't exist?
Maybe not, because Senna changed the race Formula One to Brazil. Senna broke for us something we never see before. Somebody can win with humility like a Senna. Piquet was a very good driver, but he's not like Senna. Emerson Fittipaldi was very close to Senna, but Senna is somebody that's a person come from the people for the people. You know, it's a guy like me. There's not somebody can stay outside the Brazilian's problems, outside the Brazilian situation. No, he was a person like another one all the time.
And obviously, when we talk about Senna, one of the biggest parts of his story is his death at Imola in '94. And I want to go back to that moment for you. When did you find out Senna died in '94? Where were you? How did you feel?
I was here in the United States on vacation with my wife and a couple of people from my family. We was leaving the hotel to the airport when somebody told him they have a big accident and then Senna was involved in the accident. I took the car to the airport with the luggage. When I dropped the luggage and dropped the car, somebody told the Brazilian race guy, Ayrton Senna, he passed away. Well, this was very, very difficult for me, not for me, for all the Brazilians, the entire country crying for Senna. It's something that people crying for like 3 days seeing Senna's funeral. The people was in the street. It's a lot of people, millions of people looking for the funeral, and everybody cry for that. Right? It's like if we have lost somebody on our family. Senna was a guy from my family, from all Brazilian families.
After Senna, obviously, there's never been a Brazilian champion after Senna. It was Fittipaldi to Piquet to Senna. And the next guy was supposed to be Rubens Barrichello, and then obviously Felipe Massa. After Senna died and those guys were around and didn't really live up to that same sort of level to the Brazilian drivers before. So not even just Senna, but Piquet and Fittipaldi. What was that like for you as a fan? Did you feel like you kind of lost interest in Formula One?
Well, I continue to see Formula One, but not the same way I saw before. I like a race. But if I cannot see the race on the Sundays, doesn't make a lot of difference for me, like it did before when Senna was driving. I don't have the same passion for the Formula One like I had before.
When another Brazilian driver comes along, there's a couple, obviously in Formula 2, Formula 3, all throughout, the development. When they do come through, do you think you'll tune in more attentively, or do you think it'll still be something where you just kind of watch every now and then?
Yeah, maybe I can have the same passion for the Formula One if you have a very, very good drive. But I don't think it'll be. I cannot feel the same as I feel before with Senna. Nobody can have a Senna's place. Senna's is unique. I can say Senna maybe was not better than Schumacher, not better than Hamilton. We don't know because he passed away too early. I like Hamilton. I like how he drives. But it's different when somebody stop him to do some interview. They talk different. Senna talks like a normal person, not like a king, not like a god, not like the most important person in the world. He just talks like normal people.
Thanks to my dad for stopping in and talking to us about his experience as a Formula One fan. keeping it within this same conversation so that we can understand not only how a driver can create fans of those that are watching them week in and week out, but also how a driver like Senna, who represented his country with such pride, can have his popularity echo for generations.
Hi, I'm Victor Lopez. I'm 20 years old, and I'm a big fan of Formula One from Goiânia, Brazil.
Though Victor wasn't alive while Senna was racing, he was able to become a fan of his through videos of old Grand Prix and stories from his father that illuminated Senna's greatness on and off the track. Through our conversation, we got some awesome perspective on how a driver's legacy can endure with passing generations and make fans even decades after they're no longer around. Victor, can you tell me a little bit about how you became a Formula One fan? What was that first experience like with Formula One?
So I started when I was a young kid, when I was probably about 6 or 7. And my dad, he used to do go-kart. And he showed me some videos about Ayrton Senna. And then I fell in love with the sport. I started watching every Saturday and Sunday. I couldn't miss any of the presentations. And I was like so passionate about it. And I couldn't stop watching. Every time I saw that we were about to have a race, I used to wake up like really, really early in the morning to watch it. And sometimes when they used to do it after midnight and my mom wouldn't let me stay, and then my dad came to me and he was like, oh, wake up, let's watch it. It all started with my dad. He showed me the sport, and because of him, I started watching and I fell in love with it. And I dream one day I'll be there.
Thinking back to that time, Victor, when you were a kid, when you were like, 5, 6, 7 years old, and your dad would wake you up to watch these races because your mom wouldn't let you stay awake. What are some of the memories that come to your head when you think about that moment in your life when you were first introduced to Formula One?
One of my first memories was my dad gave me a car, like it was a small car, those for kids, you know. And then he showed me Formula One. I was probably about 5, 6, somewhere around that. And I was really young, and I fell in love with it as soon as I saw it.
So, Victor, you're 20 years old now, and you said you started watching racing when you were like 5 or 6. So that's about 15 years ago, right? So it's 2021, let's say 2006. So around 2006, that's just right when, Rubens Barrichello was still racing and Felipe Massa was really kind of, making a name for himself in Formula One. Can you talk to me about what not necessarily just those Brazilian drivers meant to you as a fan, but just Brazilian drivers in general and what they meant to your fandom within Formula One?
Well, I'll start with Ayrton Senna. I wasn't born at the time, but since I fell in love with it, I started searching and I tried to watch every single race that he did. It all started with him. Felipe Massa was good. He was doing the best that he could, but he wasn't Ayrton Senna, After the accident, we didn't see any Brazilian face like representing what Ayrton did, But Felipe Massa, I watched almost every race that he did, but I was always cheering for people that were not from Brazil because I wasn't used to Brazilians racing. I remember Rubens Barrichello and Felipe, but no one could be Ayrton Senna, And I wish I was alive to see and watch him racing because I listened to my dad telling me the stories about it, and I felt goosebumps,
What were those interactions like? Tell me some of the stories that your dad told you and how you felt about, Senna, even though you never actually watched him race live.
There's one that I'll always remember. It's one of the races that he lost some of the gears that he had. I think it was during the whole race with only third gear. And he managed to win the race with just the third or fourth gear, something like that. When I first heard this story, I was like, how he managed to do that? You got to shift the gears and go back and forth to get into a curve. And I remember the interview at the race, he was talking about the pain that he felt in his body because he was doing too much effort to hold the car on the track. When I see that, I got goosebumps. Even though I wasn't alive to watch him live, I still like to watch some of his races, and he used to have the greatest speeches from the Formula One and race in general. He's my inspiration, you know. I like to see him as a guy I look after to get myself inspired. He was a great person. He used to help a lot of people. He used to be one of the greatest drivers. It's good to have someone like that from Brazil doing that kind of stuff. He was the GOAT. He was basically one of the best. So that's why I like him the most. Not because he's Brazilian, because he was humble, you know. I saw a lot of interviews that he says like, oh, why shouldn't I be humble, you know? Like, I'm like everybody else. It's not because I'm here that I need to treat people differently, you know? And that's one of the things I admire him the most, because even though he was one of the most famous person in the world, he's still that humble. He's still helping people. He was doing his part in society. I look at him and I see a great person, a great man, not just a great race driver.
If you haven't figured it out yet, I love Tijuana Flats. I would love them even if they weren't a partner with us on the Knightline Sports Network. They have all kinds of great Tex-Mex food, and it's fresh, by the way. Made to order burritos, tacos, enchiladas, chimichangas, quesadillas, bowls, nachos, and taco salads. And if you haven't tried the queso, you are completely missing out. It is the best queso that I've ever had in my life. Absolutely hands down. And the sauce bar that they have, everything from wild to mild in there. Absolutely awesome, awesome stuff. Not only do I love the food at Tijuana Flats, but I love the company, a UCF-born company. And they give back to the community with the Justin Queso Foundation. So head to your local Tijuana Flats. Tex-Mex for everyone.
I'm Jeff Allen. Join me each and every week on the Knightline Sports Network for the AAC Report. We bring you in-depth coverage of each school in football, basketball, baseball, softball, soccer, golf, tennis, and more, as well as bring you insider interviews and focus in on the biggest games and news of the week. That's all right here each week on the AAC Report, only on the Knightline Sports Network.
Thanks to Victor for stopping in and speaking about how he became a fan of a driver who passed years before he was even born. But that'll do it for episode 1 of this series. Episode 2 will be available shortly, and it will be all about a driver's journey through the developmental ranks in the U.S. Thanks for listening to the American Formula One Driver podcast. We'll talk to you soon.